Okay, Kuf Amud Aleph 100a. And we are Darash Rabbi Yehuda bar Rabbi Simon. It's about a third from the bottom of the page. The line begins with the word mai. The end of the word is mashchir. And then to the left of the middle of the line, there's the word darash with a little test next to it inside a squared bracket. There's a small little test inside the square bracket, about a quarter from the page, bottom of the page, after the word darash. So we raised a discussion on the reward in the future time for those who invest themselves in the Torah study. And it was in the context of the verse that was quoted earlier, where the verse described that the river flows from the Holy of Holies, which brings terufa, healing, and we talked about the various levels of healing. And the last of the interpretations was divide the word terufa into two, which is tar peh, that is to say, tar brings tayar panov. It brings a countenance, a shining countenance, to those who invest in peh, in the service of the lips, that is Torah study. So in that vein, the Gemara raises a number of other discussions, another number of other verses and their explanations with respect to reward for Torah study. So it says the Gemara as follows: Darash Rabbi Yehuda bar Rabbi Simon. Rabbi Yehuda, son of Rabbi Simon, expounded the following: Kol mashchir panav al divrei Torah b'mahazeh. Anyone who blackens his face in exertion in the study of Torah, is a study of, on literal meaning is the study of Torah is so in depth, and it bothers him so much to understand what the Torah is saying that his physical face gets worn out. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the expression is blackened. It means it only means it literally turns black, but it means it's worn out. It gets used up. He looks. He's got this worry on his face because he doesn't understand what the Torah is saying. So says the Gemara, HaKadosh Baruch Hu mavik zivoy lo'olam haba. God will make his countenance shine in the world to come. Whether that means life after death, or messianic era, or both. That's what it says, L'olam haba. Shnei as the verse reads, Mareu kalavanon b'chor karazim. This is a verse in Shir HaShirim. In the preceding verse, it describes those who are invested in Torah. And as a result of that, before it talks about those who blacken their faces like a raven, because they're invested in the word of Hashem, and the result is Mareu Kalavanan. Their face will be whitened like the strength of the cedar. Okay, so there's reward for investing in Torah study to get the shining face. Another one line like that, and then we'll perhaps suggest something. Rabbi Tanchon bar Chaniloi. Rabbi Tanchon, son of Rabbi Chaniloi, says similar kind of line. One who hungers himself over the words of Torah. Literally, this means he's invested in Torah study so much, doesn't eat as much, and he's literally hungry because of his Torah study. But in this physical world, God will satiate him in the world to come. Shemnemar, as the verse reads, Yirvun mideshen beisecha v'nachal adashecha t'shakim. You'll be satisfied from the deshen, from the crop of your home, and from the river of your the Nacham, not what it exactly means, but Tashkim you'll be given. We'll get delicacies of pleasure. Yeah, the Nacham is like from Madanim. Yeah, the river of your pleasure you'll get to drink. And again, the verse preceding that talks about also talks about someone who makes himself hungry over Torah study. So part of Barkin actually. Yeah, it's from Tillim.
That was 36.
No, similar, but this is in Tillim. When do we say it? We do say it sometimes. I'm trying to remember when we say it, but we do say it because the words are familiar in my head. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so just before we go to the next Gemara, which is very interesting in and of itself, just to address this a little bit, there's a glaring question here, which is, the Torah says, okay, the first one is one thing, a person's face gets blackened from Torah study, so his face, you do say it? Yeah, you have an additional Meshach.
But where do you say it?
Ma'yakar, not Barnachi Nafshi, Ma'yakar. When you're wrapping your talis, you say psukim, one of them is this.
You should be satiated with the light of your
okay.
for that field.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that the Gemara here says that someone who blackens his face over Torah study will have a shining face when in Olam Haba. Someone who hungers himself over Torah study will get satiated in Olam Haba. So the obvious question one might ask is, well, don't hunger yourself and you'll never be hungry and everything's fine. Meaning if you're hungering yourself now so that you get fed later, just eat your food now. Like what's the problem?
No, the simple case, they're talking about Torah cars that are poor. Not because they want to be poor, but that's
no. But the Gemara doesn't say is call Torah. That's one thing. But it says kol amarav means he's actively making himself hungry, even though he could have been.
Or he has an opportunity to eat, but he's more involved in Torah study.
And then he'll get to eat later. So just eat now.
He's suffering now because he wants to finish whatever he's learning, and then he'll eat later. But I
understand what he's doing. What I'm saying is, if the motivation is just the reward of eating, then eat now.
No, not for eating. The motivation is for Torah.
And therefore, I'm suggesting something deeper than that.
I said anyone's Mekayim Torah.
That's different. That's someone notwithstanding his being poor, he learns anyway. And he gets rewarded with hunger. That's something else. This is somebody not necessarily is poor. He's ma'ariv, means he's actively making himself hungry, even though ma'ariv means is the mem makes it an action. Meaning, even though he has tons of food, he's not eating because he wants to make himself. Because he wants to study Torah.
I understand that he could get a job, whatever, but he'd rather study Torah.
That's ma'ariv. Ma'ariv means he's actively making himself hungry.
But let's say not working.
Like something with machshir. Not someone who studies Torah even though he has a black face. He's making himself black. It's an active thing.
Yeah, because he's putting much more effort in Torah.
I understand. But if the only thing is that you're going to reverse...
Not doing the same shit.
I'm asking a question to lead to a point. If the Gemara is telling us the reward is you just get compensated for what you gave in, then don't give in and you won't have to get compensated, if that's the whole point. Therefore, there must be something deeper here. Namely, it's as follows. Perhaps, this means something like this. Someone who's making himself hungry in the words of Torah means to say, it's not hunger on the literal, it could be hunger in the literal sense also, but perhaps it also means hungry within the words of Torah itself. That is to say, he's studying Torah, and in his Torah study, he is hungry for Hashem. That's why he's studying Torah. Marav Atzmal Divrei Torah, not that he makes himself hungry for Divrei Torah, but he's making himself hungry within Divrei Torah. Al could also mean like on it, as in not on it, but not for it, but on it. He's making himself hungry in the words of Torah. And every word of Torah he has, he's hungry for the divine. So what's his reward? That he's going to experience the divine in the words of Torah he studied. It's the classic understanding, certainly from the Kabbalistic perspective, but even within the drush of what the world to come is. That a person does Torah mitzvahs here, and he gets to enjoy of the divinity that was created in his Torah study. So the more hungry a person is for the words of for the presence of Hashem within the words of Torah, the more he's, in other words, he's told like this: you're studying Torah because you're trying to meet the divine, and sometimes it's hard for you to see the divine within Torah. So you should know every word of Torah you have now is going to become that which you are going to eat later. The Torah itself becomes the food. Like the Alter writes in Perek Chelek, according from the Zohar, that mitzvahs become lavush, mitzvahs become the garment of the soul in the world to come, and Torah becomes the food of the world to come. Because Torah you ingest, but now you don't necessarily see the divinity of it. In the world to come, one experiences the divinity of it. So you get satiated by the very Torah you were ingesting now. And likewise, when it comes to clothing, because you invest yourself within the act of mitzvah, so it becomes your clothing that you're invested in.
So he's saying that he hungers to feel the presence of Hashem in his Torah.
That's correct.
Here in this world.
That's right. And then he's satiated by that very Torah, not something else. By the very Torah that he was studying is what he gets satiated by. And perhaps the same thing is true of Kol HaMashre Panav. Means he's going through Torah even though he's in the dark, and that he doesn't necessarily see the divine, but he's still pushing his way through it. It's still dark. And in that very darkness, in that place where he doesn't necessarily see godliness, it's going to become Mavik Panav. His face will be shining, else he'll see the actual light within the Torah that he's been studying.
But he knows he's absorbing divine wisdom as he learns his Torah. I mean, if he's learning, so he knows. So,
yeah. And
the hunger you experience is infinite because you can never get enough of this. Because what you're learning is infinite. So you just keep hungry because give me more, give me more, give me more. Like, so that's right. You never get full.
Yeah, there's two levels of this. Number one is it's every part of Torah is divinity, whether you're aware of it or not, right? But on the one hand, when you're learning about an ox that gored a donkey, what you're thinking about, what you're learning is an ox and a donkey, right? You're not necessarily conscious of the divine every time you're learning it. Right. And even the elements of Torah that are talking directly about Hashem, let's say you're learning Chassidus, so you're learning about Hashem, but you're conscious of godliness because that's what you're learning about. Nonetheless, your appreciation of it is limited on two accounts. First of all, like you said, it's infinite, so you can't know everything to begin with. So that's like a quantitative limitation. And then there's qualitative limitation, which is no matter how much you understand of divine truth, it's what Rambam calls, Chassidus calls, Yedis Metzius, which means you know its existence, but you don't know it, because you're still confined to the experiences of human reality, and to truly appreciate divine reality is not humanly possible, because we're humans. Comes the promise that you're going to get full by it, you're going to get satiated by it, you're going to appreciate it one day. So that's perhaps what the Gemara means here. Okay. Now when it comes to reward, now we're taking to a new level. Because over here it's been matched measure for measure. If we're understanding the Gemara the way we just did, which means every line of Gemara you learn in hunger, seeking the divine, you'll be satiated and full of the godliness invested in that line. The more lines of Torah one acquires in this world, then the more of godliness will be able to absorb in the next world. That's the Gemara so far. But now the Gemara is going to take it to a new level, and it's interesting that the Gemara is going to struggle with understanding it, conclude that it remains that way, even though it doesn't offer an outright explanation. But perhaps there is something deeper. You'll see what I mean. Clearly, there's obviously something deeper, but perhaps we'll suggest something.
Can we find it?
We'll suggest something here.
Can we get the light of Torah, as mentioned before?
Yeah. At least in some way.
Yeah, some way.
Okay, so let's think about this. Ki Asher Avdimi, when Avdimi arrived, meaning he arrived from Eretz Yisrael, from the Holy Land, to Bavel, where we are at the moment in our study, where the Gemara is being edited and written. So he said, in bringing Torah from Eretz Yisrael, from those who learned there, also the Kadosh Baruch Hu, God is going to in the future time grant, litain to grant, l'chol tzaddik to each and every righteous one, and we might suggest v'amech kulam tzaddikim. In the context of the beginning of this Gemara, of this chapter, all Jews are considered righteous when it comes to the reward for the world to come, as we described, with the exception of those listed before. We talked about that at length. But every tzaddik is going to get, says the Gemara, maloy masai, a full measure, like a fist or a handful, but of not human handful, God's handful, on God's terms. Shneimar, as the verse reads, Baruch Hashem Yom Yom Yames Lanu Akal Yeshuaseinu Sela. Blessed is God day by day. Yames Lanu means he provides for us. The Lord provides for us Yeshuaseinu Sela, from His salvation forever, which means the providing comes not in our terms, but Yeshuaseinu on His terms, which means some infinite terms. So now it's just at this point we already see it's a whole different level. Before now we're talking about line for line. Every line of Torah you learn, you get to experience the divinity invested in that line, and that's the reward. Whatever you're hungry for, that's what you get fed. Here it's a new level. Now you're getting on God's terms, never mind what the lines you learned. And it doesn't qualify by what you did or didn't do. But every tzaddik, and if we're going to go again with this context of the opening lines of this Gemara, all Jews are considered tzaddik when it comes to the world to come. So everybody gets rewarded from God's fist, on God's terms.
We could refer to it tzaddik in this world.
Sorry?
It's like in this world, in the world to come, he gets a special reward.
Yeah.
Because as I said, it's called. Seems to imply only certain people get called tzaddik.
Yep. I'm okay with expanding it further.
No, it's Hashem's decision.
Yeah. But if I get a vote, I'm going to expand it as much as we can. No one asked me for a vote, but I'm going to give my vote anyway in this case. Anyway, so now the Gemara is going to go through a kind of struggle with this thing. What does this mean that everybody's going to get on God's terms? How's that even possible? The large question is, when you say that a human being is going to appreciate the divinity of that which he invested, so I get it. You've invested a certain amount, and you get a return on the investment. It makes sense. But now you're telling me that for whatever it is you did, whatever qualifies to be a tzaddik, in the most expansive way possible, if we're going to go with that, then that means that everybody's going to experience infinite divinity on God's terms. How's that humanly possible? Either you cease to be human, or it's not truly infinite. It's one of the two. You can't have it both ways. And that's the struggle the Gemara is going to go with. And the Gemara is not really going to come to a point and say, here's how it works. But the Gemara is kind of going to make the point that, this is just the way it is. And the Gemara is going to quote verses just to back up the fact that this is just the way it is. But perhaps if we look a little deeper, we'll find something and we'll kind of share what Chassidus has to say, not on this Gemara directly, but on the idea in general of getting reward or getting return on the investment on God's terms, but not on your terms.
Rashi thinks that's in this world because the Olam Haba is not physical.
Sorry?
What
are you reading from?
Rashi.
Which one? Yeah, this could even be the Olam could also be the world of the world to come. Also, is limited. Doesn't have to necessarily be this world. It could be both. Anyway, Amalei Abaye. So Abaye says, "Through Rav Dimi, is it possible to say that? How is it possible to say that a human being, certainly in this world, but I would suggest even in the spiritual world, you're still a created being. How is it possible to be able to contain something on God's terms?" And he's going to quote a verse which implicates that which God grants on His terms cannot be measured. The verse already reads. The verse is in Isaiah. Mimodad b'sha'olei mayim. Who can measure from his b'sha'olei? I don't know what that word means, but from of water. Let's see what that word actually means. And where is it here? Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand? Okay, the hollow like the opening of his hand. V'shamayim b'zeres tikon, and meted out heaven with this, with the span, and comprehend the dust of the earth in a measure. In other words, that which God makes and that which God does is beyond anything one can possibly measure. And therefore, how is it possible for a human being to be able to, for every human being to be able to get that which God gives on His terms, Malaya Masa, the fullness of God's hand? How is it possible?
And there is also the pinky.
Yeah. So Amar Le, Rav Dimi responded. So Rav Dimi is interesting. He doesn't respond by saying, well, here's how it works. He just says, look, the facts are you're missing certain teachings, and it's just the way it is. And he says like this, how come you guys aren't familiar? How come you're not familiar with that which they teach in Eretz Yisrael? In Eretz Yisrael, they teach this stuff as commonplace teaching, that a human being is going to be able to experience the infinite of divine. And so why is it that you guys don't know this stuff? My time. How is it you guys aren't familiar with the teachings, with the Agada, the teachings of that which they teach in the West, Eretz Yisrael, which made the Rav Bar Marty, which is said there in the name of Rav Bar Marty, namely.
You didn't leave that long ago. How did you forget already?
Rav Dimi is telling Abaye. In other words, he came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, and he's complaining to the Babylonians that you guys don't know what we learned in Eretz Yisrael.
Right, but I mean, they haven't been out of Eretz Yisrael that long, right? At this point,
it's a few generations.
Yeah, but it's not like
hundreds of years. No,
hundreds of years.
It's a few generations.
Since Churban,
Abaye they were living in Eretz Yisrael after the Churban.
I know, but the main Torah was like Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, but even then was diminishing. So it could be 100, 200 years.
It could be less probably. Yeah. Anyway, depends who his grandfather, Abaye's grandfather was. Yeah. Anyway, so what did Rabbi Bar Marty say that you guys in Babylonia are missing? Where it says, God's going to grant to each and every tzaddik Gimel Meyes Vasara Elmas, 310 worlds. Shenemar, as the verse reads, Lahanchol Oyava Yesh, God's going to inherit to those who are beloved by Him. Yesh, I think the literal meaning is that it means substance. I'm gonna provide you with stuff.
I have the means.
I have the means to give to my beloved, but and their treasuries I will fill. But the word yesh, which means I have to give them, is yud shin. Yud shin, the word begematria, tlas mea v'esra, 310. So therefore, lahanchel oiva yesh means I'm going to grant to my beloved 310 worlds. Finished. This is the answer. No explanation. They're going to get 310 worlds. So what are you worried about how they're going to handle it? They are. This is just it.
310 word identical as this one?
I would hope not. I'm joking. Yeah. 310 worlds, usually in the spiritual realm. If you learn the Kabbalah, you know that world doesn't...
Sifirot.
A combination of sphere become a world, but then each sphere becomes a world. A world is like a dimension, a certain frame of reality. So it's 310 different visions or versions or dimensions of reality, each one being its own world. I can't tell you any more than that, but that's what it is. So the Gemara goes further. Okay. Further back and forth this discussion, in that it's measure for measure, but at the same time we're saying that it's beyond measure for measure. And the Gemara doesn't really resolve it but leaves all of them in place. I mean, Gemara does not deny that the reward is measure for measure, and yet it still maintains that the tzaddik gets way beyond his measure on God's terms, without reconciling them technically speaking. But I think there's a way of understanding it, which is like this. Tanya Rabbi Meir says, in the measure one measures himself, the way in which one presents himself, that's how he's measured. So it's measure for measure. The person behaves a certain way, the response is equal. The Ksiv, as the person reads, the Sasa b'shalcha terivena, in full measure, Hashem will send you to be content. But the word Sasa could also mean Sa'asa, meaning like one sa for a sa, one measure for a measure. Sa is a measurement. Like a mikvah is 40 sa. So one sa for a sa is how you're rewarded, so it's measure for measure. Okay? So it says, the Gemara goes back the other way. Rabbi Yeshua says, is it possible for you to say that it's just measure for measure? But we know, a person, I think this line is the key to the answer, that a person gives the fullness of his hand to a poor person in this world. God gives you from the fullness of his hand in the world to come, which means it's on God's terms, infinite. But then it goes back. Didn't we just finish saying before we quoted the verse which said that the waters of the heavens cannot be measured? God's water can't be measured. And you, the Gemara goes back. Are you saying that people won't get more than measure for measure? The Gemara asks, which measure would be greater? Midah Tova, the measure of God's goodness, God's grace, and Midah Pronus, or the measure of God's judgment, the measure of God's punishment. Heva Omer, it would be clear to say, Midah Tova Midah Pronus, the measure of goodness is better than the measure of negative. So if the measure of negative is immense, then the measure of goodness got to be even more immense. And therefore the Gemara says, when it comes to the measure of goodness, the measure of God's reward, it says, God commands the shchakim means like it's another word for the heavens. For the heavens above, the dalsa shemayim pasach, and the doors of the heavens he opens. And he's going to provide like dew for them to eat. So it talks about doors of the heavens being open to provide blessings. That's when it comes to God's reward. When it comes to the measure of punishment, it says with respect to the flood. Yeah, the flood. And the windows of the heavens are open. So and it says so it says like this. When it comes to God's punishment, it says it's a window. When it comes to the reward, it's a door. Doors are larger than windows. And yet when it comes to the reward, the punishment, it says men will go out and their flesh will be men of sin will go out, and the worms that are basically attacking their flesh won't die, and the fire that's singeing them will not cease. So it's describing great immense pain, even though it's just from a window. And therefore, if it's going to come from a door, it's going to be certainly much greater. And the Gemara says even further, like, if a person puts his finger into fire in this world, his finger gets burned right away. Therefore, if you're describing this fire that's burning the fires of purgatory as so much more immense and intense, and that's only a window, then the measure of God's reward, which is a door, has to be even greater. And therefore, how could you say that it's simply measure for measure, when seemingly it's much more?
Even punishment.
Even punishment is much more, yeah. and then reward is even greater than punishment. So what's going on? Allah says the Gemara, just like God grants the wicked strength so that they can get their punishments, so too God grants strength to the righteous, the Kabbalah Tavasim, to get their reward. So what's going on in this Gemara? Perhaps something like this. First of all, the Gemara does not negate the fact that it's measure for measure. It doesn't say it's not measure for measure. It just says that they get strength to be able to handle it. So perhaps it goes something like this. And I think the key of the line here is from Rabbi Shua, which says that a person gives of the fullness of his hand to a poor, God gives him the fullness of his hand in the world to come. And perhaps it means something like this. A person gets measure for measure, but measure for measure on God's terms, which means like this. If I go push my limit, in the service of Hashem, then the reward that Hashem gives back is Hashem pushes, so to speak, His limits. So even though it's true, God's limits are far beyond my limits, but in terms of the investure on the part of the one who's doing the act, it's equal. Even though what's pushing the limits of God is much greater than pushing the limits of me. In other words, if I do something that reflects the infinite, in that I push my limitations, then the reward can't be limited, because then that wouldn't be measure for measure. Even if what God gives me would end up being exact compensation from what I gave, then it wouldn't be measure for measure, because I didn't just give of myself on a measure term. I gave myself on beyond the measure. So the reward's going to be God beyond the measure. Like it says here, if a person gives his fullness of his hand to the poor, then God grants him the fullness of his hand. So it is measure for measure, even though one's God's hand and one's my hand.
Yeah, it's not literally mount. It's
obviously.
Yeah, that's Rashi. Especially, we actually quote a Rashi here. It says that in the Gemara so-and-so. It's dogma, you know, to Indian.
Sorry?
It's dogma.
That's right. So in other words, it's not.
It's like the same method, not the same amount.
Right. So if we're going to, that's correct. That's the right word of putting it.
That's the way.
Good. Right. The same method, not the same amount. Which means like this.
Exactly.
So whereas the Gemara before said that every line you get hungry with in Torah, you get granted to experience divinity in that, says the next Gemara, there's a whole new element here. That's one element of reward. And that's the finite element of reward. Whatever level you reached, you'll get to experience that level and enjoy it. That's one thing. Then the question becomes, what kind of investment did it take for you to get to that level? And the greater it took out of your kishkis, the greater it took out of your effort to attain that reward, then the greater the investment's going to become in that level. In other words, whatever level of Torah a person's experiencing, because he was studying X amount of Torah, so he gets to experience divinity in that Torah. But then the question becomes, what effort did he put in that? He put infinite of his own effort. Then what's going to be invested in that divinity that's going to be experienced from a study of Torah is going to be an infinite element of the divine, because you put your infinite in it. Even though God's infinite is truly infinite and your infinite is limited to your finite. But you push your limits, then the reward is God pushes, so to speak, His limits, as it were.
So you transcend even beyond what you think you can do in order to do it to achieve.
That's right. So if you transcend what you think you can do, then the level of divinity you've reached is that which transcends what God ordinarily does. And then, which means, so now let's put this into the last statement we talked about.
Beyond measure for measure.
That's right. So even though it's technically measure for measure, but it's measure for measure in the sense that, not that it's limited to what you've done, but it takes into account, besides for limited to what you've done, it takes into account what it took out of you to make that happen. So if it only took out a part of your energy, so then that's limitation of your investment. Right? In other words, the investment is not only on the result. How many lines of Torah did you learn? But it's the effort you put into getting those lines of Torah. Right. And if the effort you put in was pushing your limits, then the reward in those lines that you're going to experience divinity is going to be, as it were, pushing God's limits, reaching the infinite. You give of the fullness of your hand, God gives the fullness of His hand. Even though the fullness of God's hand is way infinite. And then finally, the last point about the measure of goodness is greater than the measure of punishment. Because we described many times, and we described it here as well, the reward is not compensation, but rather that you get to experience the divinity and the truth of what you've done. So the fact that the measure or the reward is greater in measure than the punishment is because the truth of punishment, the truth of sin, isn't really that true. On two accounts. First of all, anything that does not directly express God's truth isn't absolutely true. It's only true so long as God says, I want it to be. And God's want for sin is only a means to an end. So it in and of itself isn't fully true. The truth of a mitzvah is infinite, because that's where God wants to be. So the mitzvah itself, by dint of what it is in and of itself going to outlast sin. Which means even the greatest of punishments a person has to go through, God forbid, for the greatest of sins a person does, cannot be forever. Because sin itself isn't forever. Sin itself isn't a truth that is forever. Whereas mitzvah is in and of itself a truth that is forever, and therefore its reward is forever. That's in account number one. And account number two, and this gets to the point we were saying before about your investment. Every Jew, if we're going to take into consideration when it comes to reward and punishment, not just what you've done, but the investment you put into what you're doing, then no matter how much a person invested into sin, there's a part of him that says, I don't want to do the sin. And therefore the punishment cannot be through and through. Because there's one part of you that never wanted to do the sin. Whereas when it comes to a mitzvah, my deepest, infinite part of me wanted to do the mitzvah, and therefore, reward is going to be the investment of that infinite. Right? If the reward, as we just finished saying, is not just for what you've done, but for what's been invested, you have to look at sin. What was invested in the sin? How much of me was invested in the sin? So sometimes what's invested in the sin is I slipped. Okay, so my mind wasn't there, my heart wasn't there, it's just my hand did the sin. Okay, so it's limited to the investment of my hand, the punishment is the cleansing that I have to go through is limited to the hand's investment. I did it with heart, a little bit more of me has to be cleansed. I did it with my mind also, I schemed, a little bit more of me has to be invested. But as you go deeper and deeper, no matter how much of me is invested in the sin, there's still one part of me that did not want to be there. In the words of the Alter Rebbe, even during the moment of sin, the neshama was true to Hashem. And therefore, the cleansing cannot be infinite because you're not whole. Sorry?
Seems to be going forever. Therefore, they won't go out. And the worm won't die. This is reserved for certain people.
Even so, the Gemara has a list of very, very specific people who don't.
There's a category of some people who deny Hashem's on. It's a different category of people, not the regular sinner. But that's certainly the view of the Gemara's pasuk.
And therefore, that would explain. So I think in this way, the Gemara is kind of. Therefore, the Gemara never really comes to a conclusion and say this is right and that this. The view that's saying that the reward is beyond what you do, and the view that says that the reward is measure for measure. The Gemara never reconciles and said this one's right and that one's wrong. It just keeps going back and forth, but you have a verse this way and a verse that way. And thus I think the best way to reconcile it is, not reconcile it, to see how they coexist, is that it is measure for measure, but it takes into account not just what you've done, but also how you've done it. And the way in which you've done it pushed your limits, then God, as it were, does that on His terms as well.
But also the other key difference is Olam is Olam Haba. So in this world it can be he can make it both in measure and in the
Gemara doesn't say that, which
that's in the like Hashem gives, like if you do an act in this world, Olam Hazeh, Hashem will give His hand in Olam Haba. That's an Olam Haba. In this world,
but the Gemara would have said clearly, Kan be'Olam Hazeh, Kan be'Olam Haba. That would have been the simple answer. The Gemara doesn't do that. What are you saying? It's not so understood at all.
There's another layer here. I mean, in terms of measure for measure, I mean, the reward in this world it can only be a finite. It's a finite world, and you're in a finite body.
Yeah.
So the measure that you get in the world to come, like it says in the Mishnah, the one moment is nothing like one moment in the world to come is better than anything you'll ever have. It's just, you're now at that level. You're no longer confined. I mean, this is a Hasidic thing, but
the truth is that even Olam Haba is limited.
Physical body, so you're able to absorb as a neshama. I would think you can absorb.
But here's the irony,
an infinite amount of reward compared to what you can absorb here.
That's true, but here's the irony. Compared, yes, but Olam Haba is also a world, which means it's also limited. It's got spiritual limitations, but it's limited nonetheless.
Right, but you're not limited.
And where did you get that?
The world is limited.
And where did you get that infinite from?
Hashem,
this is the irony. And where? In the Torah mitzvah. That's the irony. The irony is that the physical mitzvah you did in this world is the real infinite. You just can't experience it now.
Right.
So there's an irony here. The physical world is certainly more limited than the spiritual world, and therefore, never mind, you can't get the infinite reward. You couldn't even get the finite world of the world to come. When you get to, if you never came to this physical world, you just stayed in the spiritual realm, you'd also be finite in terms of your relationship with Hashem. You're finite to whatever world you happen to be living in. But then when you come to the physical world, and you do a mitzvah, and that's where you touch really the infinite, then when you get to Olam Haba, now you can truly experience the infinite that you've tapped into in this physical world. And that's nice and koyach b'hem.
Right.
That's the nice and koyach, which actually is in the last few days of Tanya, where it talks about the physical mitzvah gives the neshama the capacity to be able to touch the divine, truly on the infinite level.
Right. Yeah. We're not saying anything different.
No, not at all.
But given what you're saying, but now when you're up there, your capacity, whatever you want to absorb the reward is in a different situation.
You can experience it.
You can experience.
Because you can see beyond the flesh.
Of what happens here.
Right. He has to touch the infinite here in the physical world. Yeah.
The degree of ratzon, the degree to which your ratzon goes, different levels of kavanah at the same time.
Yeah.
Because the fact that the degree of ratzon that one can have is, as you were saying, you can reach an incredible levels of stage, and so the degree of ratzon reaches different. Also, the kavanah of each person can be different. Yeah. Depending on
not just each person, but we're talking about pushing the limits.
Exactly.
So when you push your limit,
yes,
it takes a little while, and that becomes your new limit.
And each
you have to push it again.
It's like
That's
what
right.
you do it physically, what you're doing now spiritually with regard to going to enlightening yourself to such a degree that the aura of what you're doing is you're going beyond your physical limits.
So if the way in which you push your limits, if the way in which you reach the infinite is by going to your infinite, by pushing your limits, then by the nature of infinite, you have infinite amount of levels you can constantly push to your infinite self. Right?
So magnificent.
Yeah. Right. Have a wonderful day, buddy.
You too.